Today in Studio 4, the house smart Shell Buzzy returns with a patch on his heart and lots of ways to patch up your abodes. And we go to the theater. Mr. Bill Millard, Vancouver's passionate and personable artistic director, brings Next to Normal to the Arts Club stage and himself to our studio. And to begin the hour, award-winning documentary producer, true crime writer, one of Canada's finest journalists, Julian Sher, weighs in on gangs, murder, mayhem, human trafficking, and the sex trade. Stay with us. Julian Sher is an investigative journalist who writes true crime books that spark public debate and sometimes force governments to review complicated crime cases. He's written about everything from Canada's Ku Klux Klan to nuclear jihad and Hell's Angels. His most recent is a gripping book about America's prostituted children. Gangs and outlaws, of course, are always on his radar. It is my pleasure to welcome Julian Sher, national correspondent for the Globe and Mail, back to Studio 4 to tell us more. Many hats you wear.
I do. Keeps me busy, but it's always good to be here with you.
I trust you've been following the amazing story of Keenan Hebert from Sparwood, returned to his home by an abductor.
It's quite an amazing story, and you know, obviously, you could almost sense the sigh of relief that not just the parents, but I think all of us felt. And yet, you know, what's interesting about the story is, I want to be a bit counterintuitive here, is that we in the media, of course, focus on dramas like this because it's every parent's nightmare, right? Your child being abducted. But in fact, it does distort the reality in the sense that the chances of your child being harmed sexually or otherwise by a stranger, so-called stranger danger, is in fact quite rare. The vast majority, I mean, we're talking something like 80, 90% of the children who end up being abused, especially sexually abused, are usually abused by somebody in their circle of trust, which makes sense. I mean, if you're going to harm a 4-year-old or a 5-year-old, you're either going to have to kidnap him, as what has happened, and that's not good because you suddenly get a tremendous amount of attention, or if you're the hockey coach, the local priest, the school teacher, an uncle, a father, a stepfather, you do it secretly, and the abuse goes on quietly. And you know, in my previous book, One Child at a Time, I talk about, and it's unnerving, but when I talk to a crowd of people, I say, you're worried about your children, all right, that's good, but it's probably going to come from somebody you know, somebody in that child's circle of trust.
Right, but in the One Child at a Time, it was about rescuing our children from online predators. Now that surely would be a stranger, not necessarily?
No, not necessarily, because what often happens is that the pictures of abuse are being taken by a stepfather or an uncle, somebody in their circle of trust, and then they're putting these pictures up on the web and those pictures get traded. When I started investigating child prostitution, in many ways, again, it was the same thing. Obviously, first of all, there's a surprising number of young girls who are being pimped out by members of their family or people related to them.
In North America?
In North America, absolutely. But what's also shocking is that most of the girls who end up being prostituted in the streets of Vancouver or in the United States, where I spent most of my time, they too are often lured, at least at the beginning, by a boyfriend, by somebody they know. And again, it goes back to what we were just talking about Keenan, in the sense that we don't like to look in our own backyard, right? It's much easier to think of this evil person out there who's kidnapping kids. Well, it's the same thing with prostitution. What I discovered is most of us consider prostitution something that happens somewhere else, and in terms of human trafficking, these are foreign girls coming in, girls from Asia, girls from Russia. It's not the case. The vast majority of girls who are being trafficked on the downtown east side in Vancouver, in Edmonton, Toronto, Montreal, and across the States are somebody's daughter. They're our girls. They're local Canadian and American girls.
And yet it seems we tend to focus more on Eastern European girls being trafficked, brought to North America, prostituted, and yet you say, what led you to this, to write Somebody's Daughter?
Well, I was actually in Washington talking to a senior prosecutor and an FBI agent who were heroes of my previous book. And I was feeling quite good. I'd done a good book. And they said, yeah, but the problem you have to look at is child prostitution. And I had the same myths, I think, that most of us did. I sort of said, oh, yeah, those horrible stories of young kids from Russia being brought in or being brought in across from Mexico.
Right.
And they said, no, 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 you don't understand. This is a domestic problem. And it's shocking. I mean, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of minors in the United States, probably tens of thousands in Canada.
What age?
Well, the most disturbing thing, I was talking to an organizer in Winnipeg. They figure that some estimates say the average age of starting in the life of prostitution can be as young as 12 to 13. Overwhelmingly, all the women I interviewed, the young women I interviewed, certainly had started in their teens. And what police began to realize in the States, late here, I mean, there is some good work being done in Vancouver, a handful of other cities, but we're nowhere near what they're doing in the States. What police began to realize in the States, and look at what happened with the women in the Robert Pickton case, what they began to realize is that it wasn't a prostitution problem, it was a runaway problem. That the vast majority of girls who were being prostituted were runaways, that they were running from something. They weren't running to prostitution. No girl wakes up in the morning and say, wow, I'd love to be a prostitute.
I'm going to the Vegas Strip to become a prostitute.
That's right.
No.
No, they're running from something. They're running from abuse, trauma, lack of love. They're searching for something, but they're running from something. And until we address that problem, you know, we're going to miss both the runaway problem and the prostitution
And
problem.
how many of these girls do you think come from ordinary families, if there is such a thing, from high socioeconomic levels?
You know, it's actually surprising. I mean, it's true that I think the vast majority are running from some kind of dysfunction, often abuse by a stepfather, or, you know, goes back to what we were saying about the young boy and circle of trust. But, you know, one of the heroines of my book, Maria, came from a nice middle-class family, in a Catholic family in New Jersey, good parents. She loved her parents. Her parents to this day love her. What happens? There's always a trigger event. She's 12 years old, goes out with a boyfriend of a cousin, gets raped, keeps it secret for a bit, then finally tells her parents. The family really can't deal with it. She starts breaking down, hangs out on the boardwalk in Atlantic City, and will be dragged into a prostitution network. And only when one brave FBI agent begins to work with her, convinces her to work with him and take down this pimp, is her life to some degree saved.
Who dragged Maria into the network?
You know, what the pimps say is the best kind of victim is somebody who doesn't know she's a victim. So nobody forcibly dragged her in. The pimps, and you can get these books on Amazon. That's the most frightening thing. You can go to Amazon. You want to be a pimp today? Go on Amazon, put in pimping or pimpology. You'll get guidebooks on how to be a pimp. And when you think about it, it's like how to be a slave trader, how to be a human trafficker. And these books will say...
How to be a murderer.
Well, and they'll say, and they're very accurate, they'll say, look for a girl who has a weakness. Look for that fragility. And that's what these guys do. They saw in Maria a young 13-year-old girl who was worried, didn't feel love, wanted a bit of action, and they convinced the girls, we love you. I'm your daddy. That's the actual word that they use.
I'm your daddy, not your boyfriend.
That's right. I'm your daddy, but also let's have sex, but also, hey, if you really love me, I'll get you nice clothes, but also you've got to have some sex with, you know, with men, and they get lured in that way.
And who trains the girls?
Oh,
I mean, literally trains the girls. When you're 12 or 13, you haven't had a lot of sexual experience. So
well,
in your handbook...
Well, the pimps do a fairly good job, but they have what's called a bottom girl, which is one of the women inside their stable, that's what it's called, will always train the new recruits. And a lot of the women, and here's the real tragedy, will actually start bringing in their younger sisters or their friends. And so it becomes an expanding network. What's worrisome, though, is that right now, in the United States, the FBI has a special squad that does nothing but go after pimps and rescue girls, right? Dozens of agents specially trained who are out there. There are special police forces now in Dallas, in Oakland, who are working to try to stop the trafficking. And we don't have that in Canada. We have a couple of people in Vancouver, in a couple of other cities, but if you look at our arrest statistics, if you look at our court statistics when it comes to pimps and Johns, it's quite discouraging.
So a new breed of police officer, obviously in the United States, trying to rescue girls. Not so much here.
No.
Why not here? Is the problem as bad here?
Well, I don't think it's as bad as the United States, but there's no reason to think that Canada is somehow this oasis of bliss and we don't have human trafficking. Canada passed a human trafficking law in 2005. Which deals with all kinds of trafficking, sex, labor. Since 2005, there have been this many men who have been arrested for procuring, in other words, Johns. Under trafficking.
Zero.
Zero. There's been something like 30 trafficking cases overall since 2005, and so far that's left to only 5 pimps being charged. Now, either Canada is pimp-free,
And we know that's not the case.
You know, and we got all 5 that are, you know, that are serious. Or there's a huge number of pimps out there who are prostituting our young girls, and we're not doing anything about it.
So why is it a crime that's so underreported? I'm assuming it's underreported.
It is underreported. Well, it literally is a crime that's in the dark corners that we don't see. And who's going, you know, what police say is that most of our crime, look at the horrible kidnapping of Keenan, there's a victim advocate. A parent gets on the phone and says, my kid is missing, or my kid is on drugs, right? Even, you know, when a biker shoots somebody or whatnot, there's a victim who will call up. So that's the way police usually react. These kids, nobody cares for them. So you usually don't have a parent or a loved one who's calling out. The kid themselves is enthralled with their pimp, so they're not going to call. The John, who's going to be a middle-class guy from West Van or North Van or a comfortable neighborhood driving down to pick up a girl, he's not going to report it. So no one's reporting this crime.
And these are children.
They are.
They're not 18-year-olds or 21-year-olds.
That's right. They're 16, choices. 17, 15. And of course, the irony is, don't forget, it is illegal in Canada. You cannot consent to sex if you are under 18.
Right.
You know, if you say, oh, I wanted it, doesn't matter. It's still illegal. But the girls are still charged with a crime that they're too young to commit. They cannot consent, and yet, if they're picked up, they could be charged with a prostitution offense.
One thread that runs through the stories, like Maria, is these kids are running from some kind of nightmare. What else? What did these women, these young girls, have in common? And I'm sure there's young boys too. Of course there are.
Well, you know, I was just in Oakland on Friday. I was speaking at events there, and they invited me into a juvenile hall to meet some of these young girls. There were about 50 girls paraded in this detention center, which is basically a prison for young offenders. And what you could see, I mean, in this case, they were freshly scrubbed, and they were wearing prison pink sweatshirts. They were tough, they were smart, but you could see one of the common things, not only were they running from something, is they did not have a sense of self-worth. They felt that nobody cared for them, and so they were going to struggle to survive. And if it was a daddy or a pimp who was going to treat them with they thought was respect, they would go for that. And because the rest of the system, because the cops aren't trained to listen to them and treat them. There was a great story in my book where one of the cops who realizes we have a problem, most of the cops around them are saying, hey, a whore is a whore is a whore. So when the young girls see that, when they see on the Oscars 2006, the best song of the year, billions of people saw the best song of the year was It's Hard Out There to Be a Pimp. When they see movie stars and TV stars talking about pimping and making heroes
glamorizing it in a sense.
So what's a young girl going to think? Is she going to run to social services? Is she going to run to her teacher or her parents or a cop when everybody is downgrading her and treating her like dirt?
I understand that, and I also understand that some of them make not a low salary.
That's right.
They could work at the lunch counter, or they can work as a prostitute, and some of these young women are making fairly good money. The pimps are taking a lot. When we come back,
they're taking all of it.
All of it. Oh, that too. But when we come back, let's talk about that and what happens when one of these girls or these boys confront their tormentor. Okay. Julian Sher, our guest, his newest book, Somebody's Daughter, The Hidden Story of America's Prostituted Children and the Battle to Save Them.